Hello everyone, good morning. Thank you for joining me today for Perry Johnson Registrars Food Safety Inc.'s webinar titled GlobalGAP and FSMA, The Road to Compliance. So before we get started today, I just want to go over a couple things. I want to let you know that our slides and recording will be available at the end of the presentation. They can be downloaded from our website at www.pjrfsi.com. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them into the box and they'll be answered at the end of the presentation. All right, let's go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Maureen Maloney. I'm PJR FSI's, or Perry Johnson Food Safety Inc.'s, Food Safety Program Manager. I'm also a GlobalGAP auditor and a Produce Rule Lead Trainer. So first I want to start off by going over what is GlobalGAP. Many of you may have heard of GlobalGAP before, and some of you may even be certified to it. It was started in 1997 as GAP. In 2007, it was renamed GlobalGAP to capture its global reach and its goal of becoming the lead international GAP standard. And GAP stands for Good Agricultural Practices. The standard covers food safety, sustainable production methods, worker and animal welfare, responsible use of water, compound feed, and plant propagation materials. Integrated Farm Assurance, or IFA for short, is GlobalGAP's flagship scheme. It's the most utilized food safety scheme for fresh produce in the world. This is also a GFSI, or Global Food Safety Initiative benchmark scheme. And the IFA modules cover crops, livestock, and aquaculture. Today we'll be focusing on the crops module with the subscopes fruit and vegetable. We're also going to cover FSMA. So what is FSMA? FSMA is the Food Safety Modernization Act. It became law on January 4th, 2011, and it aims at reforming our food safety laws. This sweeping reform shifts the focus of food safety laws from not just responding and containing food safety incidences, but to preventing them. The law contains multiple rules within the regulation. 4 of the main rules are the preventive controls for human food, preventive controls for animal food, Food Safety Verification Program, FSVP, and Produce Rule. Today we're going to discuss the Produce Rule because that applies to fruit and vegetables. This established standard for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fruits and vegetables. It establishes the science-based standards for growing of these things for human consumption. Now, the key requirements in the rule include biological soil amendments, water quality, water testing, domesticated and wild animals, worker training, health and hygiene, and tools and buildings. We're going to focus on the requirements for fruit and vegetables covered by the Produce Rule, and we're not going to be included the regulation on growing of sprouts. So let's talk a little bit about Produce Rule compliance states. So although FSMA was signed into law in 2011, the FDA has given a timetable for compliance so that farms have time to implement these new regulations. The compliance dates are broken down by business size. The business size is based on the average annual monetary value of produce sold during the previous 3 years. So for very small businesses between $25,000 and $250,000, their compliance dates are not until January 27th, 2020. For small businesses between $250,000 and $500,000 of the annual monetary value of produce sold for the last 3 years is January 28th, 2019. And then for all other businesses of $500,000 or more, compliance dates is January 26, 2018. So that 2018 date is fast approaching. Now, these dates do not include the water-related compliance dates because on June 6, 2017, pretty recently, FDA announced it was extending the compliance dates for the agricultural water standards within the produce safety rule. This is for produce other than sprouts. So this was a pretty big announcement that the dates were extended, but they don't have a tentative new dates yet, so it's in process. So I'll talk more about that in a future slide. So GlobalGAP and FSMA. One common question I get is, if my farm is GlobalGAP certified, is it also compliant to the produce rule? Surprisingly, the answer is no. Many of the GlobalGAP IFA requirements go well beyond the requirements of the produce rule regulation. But in a few places, the produce rule deviates from GlobalGAP. So we're going to discuss those deviations today. The GlobalGAP has developed a user guide and self-assessment for FSMA's produce safety rule compliance. They found that IFA users meet the majority of those produce rule requirements, but revealed some fundamental differences. The guide compares the IFA scheme with the produce safety rule, highlighting the identified gaps between the two. It was developed for IFA users in both the United States and other countries that export to the U.S., and it's for them to use to assess their compliance to the produce rule. We will be exploring some of those fundamental differences and gaps today. So first I want to go through applicability and exclusions as it applies to GlobalGAP and the produce rule. The produce rule has a complex area of exclusions and exemptions. GlobalGAP does not exclude any operation based on size. The produce rule excludes farms that have an average annual value of produce sold during the previous 3-year period of $25,000 or less. So for our compliance dates, we saw different compliance dates for farms of $25,000 or more of average annual value. But here, if you have less than the $25,000, then you're actually excluded. It also excludes produce used for personal or on-farm consumption. So that produce would not fall under the produce rule. GlobalGAP does not exclude any produce. GlobalGAP has a comprehensive list of fruit and vegetables that are produced all over the world. Depending on your farm's scope, the applicable fruit and vegetables will be listed on your certificate. GlobalGAP does allow for voluntary exclusions, but that would be up to the farmer to decide which produce would be certified. In the produce rule, the fruits and vegetables that are raw agricultural commodities are referred to as covered produce. This means that they are often eaten raw, and thus the produce rule applies to those products. Some examples that are listed in the regulation include avocados, carrots, grapes, mushrooms, peppers, raspberries, and tomatoes. The regulations list is not exhaustive, and it's up to the farmer to make sure the produce is specifically included or excluded. Now, the list I gave was just an example. There's maybe, 40 or 50 different products listed. So for what produce are excluded, they exclude rarely consumed raw produce. The FDA has identified those specific commodities in the regulation. This includes produce such as asparagus, garden beet, sour cherries, collards, sweet corn, eggplant, peanuts, pumpkin, sweet potato, and food grains, just to name a few. You can find the current list of the 30+ excluded products on the FDA website and in the regulation. I've put the link down on the slide at the bottom. The key here is to know that unless the produce is specifically listed under the excluded commodities, then it is covered by the produce rule. So the produce rule also has some exemptions. This is a little different than the exclusions. So again, GlobalGAP does not have any produce exemptions. The produce rule, on the other hand, if your farm on average in the previous 3 years has less than 500,000 annual food sales, and a majority of the food by value is sold directly to qualified end users, then you may qualify for an exemption. Now, a quality end user is defined by the regulation as the consumer of the product. So this includes produce sold at farmers markets, CSA, or on-farm sales directly to that end user or to that person. It also includes produce sold to restaurant or retail food establishments that are located in the same state or Indian reservation as the farm, that produce the food, or are not more than 275 miles from the farm. So in that case, if you meet both of these requirements, then your produce could be qualified for an exemption. Another exemption would be if your produce is intended for commercial processing that adequately reduces pathogens. For example, commercial processing with a kill step, meaning if you sell 100% of your tomatoes to Campbell's Soup, then your produce may fall under the exemption. So if your produce is eligible for an exemption from the rule, you must make certain statements in your documentation accompanying the produce. You must obtain certain written assurances and keep proper documents and records. So you may be eligible for the exemptions, but you need to keep this information so that if you're ever audited by the FDA, you'll be able to prove that your farm does fall under the exemptions. Let's now explore some of the major differences between GlobalGAP and Produce Rule key requirements. They both cover personnel qualifications and training. Both of them require workers must be trained in personal hygiene and food safety. GlobalGAP requires that all persons working on the farm receive annual hygiene training appropriate to their activities. Produce Rule requires that the FDA requires a supervisor or responsible party be assigned to ensure compliance with the Produce Rule. One supervisor or responsible party must successfully complete food safety training. Currently, the only food safety training recognized as adequate by the FDA is the Produce Safety Alliance, or PSA, grower training course. And so we'll talk more about these courses at the end. GlobalGAP and Produce Rule both stipulate the use of biological soil amendments like raw or uncomposted animal manure on the farm. GlobalGAP IFA says for tree crops it must be incorporated into the soil prior to bud burst, or exceptionally it may be incorporated in a shorter interval based on a risk assessment, but it should never be shorter than 60 days prior to harvest. For all other crops, it needs to be incorporated at least 60 days prior to harvest. In the case of leafy greens, GlobalGAP also refers to them as pot herbs, greens, vegetable greens, leafy greens, or salad greens. It cannot be applied after planting, even if the growing cycle is longer than 60 days. The FDA has yet to determine the specific number of days between raw manure application and harvest. Currently, FDA allows the National Organic Program standard of a 120-day interval for crops with soil contact and 90 days for crops not in contact with the soil. The produce rule does require that untreated biological soil amendment of animal origin, such as raw manure, must be applied in a manner that does not contact produce applicable to the regulation during application and minimizes the potential contact with the produce after application. For the use of compost on the farm, GlobalGAP says that a risk assessment must include the type of organic fertilizer, method of treatment to obtain organic fertilizer, microbial contamination, weed seed content, heavy metal content, timing of application, and placement of organic fertilizer, whether that's direct contact to edible part of the crop or in the ground between crops. The produce rule specifically recognizes two types of composting methods. The first method, aerated static composting, is aerobic with a minimum of 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days, followed by curing with proper management to ensure elevated temperatures throughout all materials. The second type of composting method recognized by the produce rule is turn composting. This is also aerobic with a minimum of 131 degrees Fahrenheit, but for 15 days, a minimum of 5 turnings followed by curing. So if you're going to use compost on the farm, you'll have to make sure that the steps are taken, one of these two methods are taken to qualify for the produce rule. So, agricultural water is defined by the produce rule as water that is intended to or likely to contact produce or food contact surfaces. This includes water used in growing activities, like irrigation water applied using direct water application methods, and water used for preparing crop sprays. GlobalGAP requires a risk assessment to cover production-specific factors such as crop, water source, and contact crop. A testing program for water microbial quality is normally required or advisable based on the risk assessment. Actions must be taken and proven to be effective if test results indicate water microbial quality does not meet required thresholds. For the produce rule, requires a water quality metric to be established while allowing for fluctuations in water quality that occur in agricultural environments. The FDA has developed 2 numerical criteria methods for establishing the farm's water quality metrics. The regulation states if the water does not meet these criteria, corrective actions are required. Now, I'm not going to go into depth on the 2 methods for establishing a water quality metric because currently the FDA, as I had spoken about before in the compliance dates, is extending the compliance dates for those agricultural water standards. As they're exploring ways to simplify the standards after receiving feedback from the stakeholders that some of these requirements are too complex to understand and implement. So they've suspended these compliance dates for agricultural water while they review these methods that they have put out, and they will either change the methods or they'll just extend the compliance dates further into the future. So we're going to keep a watch on that with the FDA website, and we'll post to our website and social media as we hear more about those dates. So as mentioned earlier, GlobalGAP has published a user guide and self-assessment for FSMA produce safety rule compliance. This helpful guide can be downloaded on the GlobalGAP website. It is a detailed comparison and self-assessment checklist so the user can make the necessary adjustments to comply with the produce rule. It is not audited as part of the GlobalGAP IFA certification process, and it's just a helpful guide for farmers. Every operation should review the produce rule for compliance details. So what can PJR FSI offer? PJR FSI offers accredited GlobalGAP certification. We can offer both the International IFA standard and the USA Produce Safety Rule, or PSS standard. The PSS standard focuses on the produce safety requirements, but does not include sustainable production method and worker and animal welfare sections. The PSS is only applicable to farms growing in the U.S. and selling to customers in the U.S., or foreign farms that sell exclusively to the United States. PJR FSI can also offer both an IFA or a PSS pre-assessment. A pre-assessment allows you to assess your preparedness for certification and identifies any gaps in compliance. PJR FSI offers a produce rule readiness assessment. One of our inspectors will use a PJR FSI produce rule checklist to assess the farm's compliance with the produce rule. They will provide a report identifying any gaps. This is not a certification, but a tool for understanding if you're compliant to the new regulation. PJR FSI can also offer the Produce Safety Alliance grower training. I've been approved by the PSA as a lead trainer. This training is aimed at fruit and vegetable growers and others interested in learning about produce safety, the Food Safety Modernization Act, Produce Safety Rule, good agricultural practices, and co-management of the natural resources and food safety. We offer this course both as a public training at our headquarters in Troy and on-site farm training. You may remember all farms need at least one supervisor or responsible party to attend this PSA grower training. The seven modules include Introduction to Produce Safety, Workers' Health, Hygiene and Training, Soil Amendments, Wildlife, Domesticated Animals and Land Use, Agricultural Water, production water and post-harvest water, post-harvest handling and sanitation, and how to develop a food safety plan. After attending the entire course, participants will be eligible to receive a certificate from the Association of Food and Drug Officials, AFDO, that verifies they have completed the training course. Our next public course is scheduled for July 10th, 2017, and the training is 1 day in length. We are available anytime for on-site training course, and it can be combined with a GlobalGAP training or mock audit for a total of 2 days in length. You can visit our website to see a full list of available services, or contact me anytime. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm now available for any questions. And again, you can reach me by phone or by email. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'll just wrap up. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.